color and form are used in a way, it'll all repeat anyway. Color and form are used in a way that the end objective is not replication of the world around us, but the end objective is inspiring in the viewer feelings and emotions and a sort of emotional reaction, right? That many of the expressionists linked to the spirit, the human spirit, right? Emotions. Because the intellect and the spirit are not the same thing, right? And back through the history of Western thought, there is this polarization between thought, reason on the one hand, and feeling and emotion on the other hand, right? This is why starting the class off with Matisse and the Fauves versus Picasso and the Cubists made a lot of sense, because that Picasso and the Cubism, especially in the early phases, is very, very rigorously thoughtful, analytic. Right? They use the term analytic cubism. Matisse is much more expressive, right? And the Fauves, we'll see, is the Fauve movement, which remember begins 1905, right? Is in fact a very important movement when it comes to how German expressionism develops. Even though many of the expressionists, one of them in particular, we'll talk about today, tried their darndest to deny it. Like, it didn't come from Matisse and the French, typical German, right? Not the French, anything but the French, right? This is coming from something internal. We'll talk about these things, right? So the dominant movement in Germany, Expressionism, 1900 to at least 1930, and arguably through the rest of the century, arguably to today, right? I say to 1930 because Hitler kind of interrupted it all. Kind of. That's an understatement, right? So it takes many different guises, Expressionism does, right? There are sub-movements, but there are also, and these sub-movements and particular artists tend to be linked to particular cities. Because when we talk about French art, there's Paris, right? That's kind of it. And you get these artists that go outside of Paris to go somewhere else to get away from it all, like Van Gogh, like Gauguin, right? But on the norm, if you're going to make art and succeed in art, it's Paris. And that's where they'd send their stuff to be sold. Germany doesn't work that way, right? In Germany, there are numerous art centers of equal importance. Even though, the most prominent city in Germany is Berlin, right? Then and now, right? The biggest, the most metropolitan region. But it's not an art center in the dominant way that Paris was. Okay, so each of the cities has their own kind of identity. And what we find, part of the reason that Expressionism is kind of fragmentary, and all these different movements, is that each of the cities sort of had their own thing going on, right? Because of the range of art centers, right? So Katie Kollwitz, who we're looking at here, first, she's our first prominent woman artist that we're looking at. We'll look at in some detail. We saw Sophie Delaunay-Turc when we looked at the Orphists. But for us now, this is the first time we're going to sort of see a number of works by a woman artist. She's in Berlin, right? There's Berlin. And she's not really associated with any particular subgroup, right? She's not a member of Die Brücke, which you now are beginning to familiarize yourself with, or the Blauer Reiter, or any of these other artistic subgroups with their own manifesto, right? She's an outlier, if you will. And I mean that in the best possible way. She's independent from these groups. And she begins working in the mid-1890s. Now you'll notice that for modern art, we're casting ourselves back to the 19th century. This is the same time period as the Symbolist movement, right? When we looked at the Symbolists, we looked at a number of artists from that period, active in the 1890s, Gauguin not the least of them, right? But also Edvard Munch, right? The printmaker, the Scream, right? Who's also active in the city of Berlin. So they're rubbing shoulders, right? They're not collaborating in any respect, but they are contemporaries with each other in the same city at the same time. And we'll see, I think this has a huge The difference between Munch and the Expressionists is smaller than any differences. Right? The similarities are... No, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The differences are smaller than the similarities. Right? The similarities far outweigh the differences. Right? So Kollwitz, this particular print, Despair Not, right, was the first print in a series of 7 prints. These are lithographs that Kollwitz did that were entitled The Weavers' Revolt. The Revolt of the Weavers. These are linen weavers, right? Weavers of fabric, who, because of the horrible conditions of life, extreme poverty, and resulting sickness, rose up for better working conditions. And in this particular one, in the first print, well, you can read it, right? There's a mother grieving over her child. The baby innocent, almost ghost-like, pale in the bed. We don't know if the child is dead or alive. Right? And you almost get the sense that the mother is grieving because the child is dying. And the poverty of the condition is picked up with the darkness that we see around them. We see the tools of the trade, the scissors of the linen weavers in the background. But this is a decrepit interior with broken windows and crowded herein. A family living together, probably far too crowded for them. We see the loom behind her on your right, also relating to her. So she's working out of her house, right? Raising the family within this environment where she's also working. And the rest of the family off to the left, an older child, presumably her husband, right? And we're now either terrified over the sickness of the child or mourning its death. And it's not entirely clear. But the point is that Kollwitz is pointing you, the viewer, into the extreme social suffering of the figures, to elucidate, to bring forth this this expression, right? This emotion in you, the viewer. These are works of art that are not meant to be looked at and simply turned away from. You need to engage, right? It reaches out toward your emotions, and in this case, through the narrative, right? In the second of these prints from the series, and lithograph means that it's drawn in crayon on a piece of limestone that's treated, so that parts of the limestone bead water away and other parts accept water, keep water on the surface, and you roll it with a oil-based ink, right? And you can then transfer the images. It's what newspapers were often illustrated with. But the second print in the series shows death now coming. And in this case now, so the mother is here mourning the passing of the son, maybe, or the child, or worried about its sickness. And I guess the title Despair Not is, on one level, is death a better place than this life? You know, is that what Despair Not refers to? Right? That the child's going to a better place than the weaver's existence. But in the second image, right, we see the mother now dying. Her child, who's in the background here, looking on. The husband now grieving her passing. Death comes to everyone. And it's simply called death, and we actually see the manifest figure of death reaching in. So there's a skull here, coming in from behind the figure who's blocking our view. And the skeletal arm reaches out to take her. She's being now taken away by death itself. What caused her death? This is made obvious by the fact that there's an overturned bowl here in the center. It's about poverty, starvation, right? The lack of an ability to maintain a lifestyle based on this existence. And the point for Kollwitz is social justice, right? If you and I don't see this kind of existence that we don't have, we can't ever hope to be empathetic to their problems. And she sees her art as having a very, very strong sort of social element, which is something I think we as artists, in one way or another, ought to think about our actions and whether or not our actions have a positive impact on the world around us. Now, like I said, she's working at the same time as Edvard Munch, right? And Munch is here with another lithograph that looks more like a woodcut. And while in style she's very different, she doesn't have the sort of distortions of form or the sort of pantheistic activation of nature, right, that Munch has, where sky and land and sea all seem as if they're alive. Right? She doesn't have any of that. But what she does share with Munch is an interest in certain thematic choices, right? The overall depressing quality of some of the subjects that she chooses. I didn't show you this one before, but another Munch, Dead Mother with Her Child, is exactly the same theme that Kollwitz is treating. And again, these artists are both working in Berlin around exactly the same time, even though this one dates a little bit later. Right? Munch's take on the same theme that Kollwitz is dealing with, which is how does a family react to the loss of one of its leaders, right? In this case, the mother. And of course, Munch distorts form in order to make that expressiveness that much more strong. Okay? So expressionism can be thematic, it can also be stylistic, and we'll see that Munch's cartoonish distortions become something that other artists pick up on as well as we move into German expressionism more deeply. Kollwitz's most resonant theme, and one she treated throughout her entire career, are images of a mother with her dead child. Her own child would eventually die, but not until 1913. And she was already doing this theme for about 10 years before then, maybe even more, a dozen. So they're oddly prophetic and kind of frightening that way. Like, be careful about what what happens, what you take on as a theme. I'm not a big believer in fate, but I think that that's kind of part of it. In many of these images of the mother with her child, the mother's face is Kollwitz's self-portrait as well. This one alludes to it without making it entirely clear, but we see a mother almost as if she's trying to absorb the child into her arms, into her body, bring him back in to that space he left before dying, and using the melding of these two forms together. Excuse me. Notice how the head of the child really is almost the exact same tonality of the leg behind it, because they really are becoming one in grief, or she's becoming one with her child in grief. And what Kollwitz wants us to realize is that the pain, the suffering that the mother is feeling in these is indeed universal, something that we should all understand and try to empathize with, right? This is an etching, and many of you may know this is where now, instead of drawing on a stone with wax-based crayons, you're carving into a metal plate and rubbing ink into the lines that you've carved, right? It also means you have the opportunity to add plate tone to it, so the yellows that you see are sort of added to the surface of the copper plate that she's been engraving, right? She's a terrific printmaker, and the majority of the works that survive are either printmaking or sculpture, and really harrowing imagery throughout her career. To make this more universal, one of the things that Kollwitz does is to turn back to the history of art for prototypes for this image of the mother coddling the dead body of her child. And on a certain level, it ends up looking like a Madonna and Child. Now, granted, when Mary coddles the infant Christ, right, he's not dead, right? He's alive. But at the same time, theologically speaking, she knows he's going to die. And you, the viewer, know that that's why he's here, is to sacrifice for us all. And many times artists doing this will allude to that idea by making Christ all wrapped up in swaddling clothes to look like the way you wrap up a body for burial, right? And to draw a connection between the Virgin cuddling Christ with the idea of a pietà, where the Virgin is mourning the death of her son. Rembrandt definitely does this. One of the things that I think is true in the history of art is that printmakers tend to be more deeply aware of the history of their craft than other artists do. And it's partly because printmaking is so technical. It's so process-oriented that one of the things you're doing if you're in a printmaking studio, in a printmaking class, is you're figuring out how they did that. How do you get particular effects? And the best way to find that out is to look at other prints, to see how they achieved coloristic or atmospheric or sculptural effects. And so whenever we look at people who are printmakers in the history of art, Goya, for example, or many of our expressionists, we're going to find that they're deeply steeped in the history of printmaking. And so to draw a connection between Kollwitz and Rembrandt, of all people, it's not that far of a stretch, because it's easy to collect prints, much easier than it is to collect paintings, because there's multiple impressions of each one of these, right? So you can pick them up. So even today, you can pick up that Rembrandt for about $30,000, whereas a Rembrandt painting would cost you about $30 million, right? So they can be had on a budget, right? I can say that in 22207, where $30,000 isn't even the down payment on a house, right? What would you rather have, down payment on a house or a Rembrandt print? Give me the Rembrandt print, right? Also, Rembrandt based his on this print by Mantegna. I think you can see how close this similarity is, right? The idea of the swaddling mother. It's a beautiful print from the 15th century. And Rembrandt collected prints. He knew this one. Kollwitz, I think, also collected prints as well, and is very aware of the fact that this work is drawing on these images of the Madonna Child. And the point is to make it more universal, right? To make it a timeless statement of human emotion. And at the same time, she's looking back to images of what's called a pietà. This is a scene that's not found in the Bible, but where the Virgin Mary carries the body of her son. You guys have seen this live, right? And Hunter. It's in the Vatican, where she carries now the body of her son and mourns him. But you'll notice, obviously, the difference. There's something about, dignified and unemotional about Michelangelo. It's more sort of an intellectual response. It's a pathos there. But for Kollwitz, it's full-on trauma. It's full-on sadness. And to illustrate the fact that she knows that this is, secularized Christian imagery, she has another print. This is a lithograph called Pietà from the same time. And you can see that apart from the titles that she gave them, it's the same image, roughly, right? It's the same idea, a mother swallowing with her body the lifeless form of her child. I think the one on the left is much more powerful, much more amazing composition, right? But the fact that this is titled Pietà tells us quite directly that Kollwitz is aware of these traditions of religious imagery that she's now making more universal than that, right? Applicable to everyone. Death seems to have been a theme that ran throughout her works. Her father was a doctor, and so she grew up. He ran one of those. Back in my day, often doctors ran their practice out of their house, and you would just go see them at their house, and their family could be there as well. It's less the case these days, right? But that was the case in Kollwitz's day. Her father was a general physician. And so she was always seeing the sick and the suffering coming and going out of her house. And she said that this was why she focused so intensely on on the suffering of mankind was because this is what she'd experienced growing up in the house of her father, the physician. So in this case, we see death reappear, right? So here's a woman and child, the same thing we have here. This is definitely a self-portrait. That's her. She's got this slight upturned button nose and these really strong sort of semicircular eyebrows. That's Kate Colwitz. That is a self-portrait there. And she's now has her arms around the youthful, undernourished, dead child. And you can see sweeping up from the left is a skull that we see sort of from the back in three-quarter lost view. So here's the cheek arch, the zygomatic arch, right here. And that's looking sort of this direction, right? But I think we're seeing it somewhat from the back of the leg.
Sorry, I didn't get, does something happen to her life?
Sorry?
Is that something that happened to her life?
Not yet, oddly, right? We have a couple of artists that we see. Her son died in the war, in World War I, which is broken out of that, right? But we have a couple of artists who are interested in the anxieties of the modern world, who give us works of art that are oddly prophetic, right? She had no way of knowing her son was going to die. Right? But in this particular image, she imagines herself with a dead child, right? And I think that in many ways that sort of taps into a more universal fear that I'm not a parent, but I can imagine that if I were, I would have this ongoing fear about something happening to this thing that is me, right? That is part of who I am, right? That there's got to be a certain point when that letting go and just letting them go out and do their thing, and you guys, right? Your parents, letting you go out and be somewhere else where you're not protecting them from harm and potential death. So there's got to be a fear in that, right? And I think that what Colwitz is expressing is exactly that fear. She wants to hold on. She wants to make sure she protects it. But on a certain level, you can't, right? So here, death literally comes in, as we saw with the weaver. I'll get you in a second. I want to rest your arm. I'll get you in just a second. Let me just finish this idea. No, don't do that. I just want you to rest your arm. You don't have to hold it up. So we see death coming in just like as we did with the weaver's revolt picture, right? To snatch the child away. And the mother doing everything she can to keep it there, right? To hang on to it in the advent of this. And I think she's striking into this universal human fear about our inability to truly protect those things that we love, to preserve against the thing that we can't, none of us can stop death. That's the bottom line. Lena.
I think it even pushes it further when you show the mom with the younger children, because they are there always watching them, but they still are powerless against,
right.
Poverty. Like even in the earlier photos, like she's working out of her house, she's watching her children all the time.
Right.
And she still can't save them from the inevitable.
And especially with that, because the inevitable there, the fear not, right, or despair not, with that first image that we saw. The inevitable also is, the one inevitable she also can't protect them from is the inevitability of death. But in that particular case, the inevitability of being sucked into an industry that's going to eat you alive, right? That's the other issue, right? Because she can't protect them from that either. That's going to happen. Those kids, as soon as they can walk around on their own, are probably going to get put to work. Because there's a system that doesn't provide, right? And this is well in advance of any kind of child labor laws. Okay? So you're absolutely right, Lena. I think that's spot on, right? That idea of the forces that are out there that we simply cannot protect against. Now, the idea of death coming in to literally snatch the figures from the living, right? Take them away, ties Colwitz's works again to the history of printmaking. And in particular, something we see with a number of expressionist artists in Germany is a deep, deep interest in early German art. Some of the earliest German art after the Middle Ages, and some of it even before then. So, for example, Hans Holbein did a series of woodcuts that illustrated the Dance of Death. And this is where death comes to visit everybody in the world. He didn't do a Death and the Mother. right? But he did do a death with every sort of profession that was out there. So in this case, the Arzt is the doctor, the physician, right? And he's here and he's writing his books. He's got his dog, right? Got his clock. He's on the clock. But death now comes, and he's telling him, "You're going to die," right? And what he's got in his hand is a urine bottle, because that's how doctors diagnose disease, was from the color of your smell of your urine. They taste it even. I kid you not. I did a paper on this once, right? So they're you who do prognoses, right? You who diagnose disease and offer a prognosis for how to get better. Well, guess what? I've got your diagnosis, and you're gonna die, right? And that's what death is telling him. Ha ha! See, I'm the real doctor. I'm the one who knows when the end times have come. And so here he's coming in to grab him away. He's already taking somebody with him behind him, right? This is a huge series of prints, right? Here he is with the nobleman and literally dragging him away, and the nobleman fighting in vain against this. Kollwitz knows these traditions, right? The idea of death coming to snatch the living, and is incorporating them into her works. And what we'll see with other expressionists that we look at is that, especially today, this legacy of German Renaissance art, especially German Renaissance woodcuts, woodcuts. Do you guys know from woodcuts? Do you know what we're talking about with woodcuts? It's worth going over, right? With a woodcut, you've got a surface. Here, I got a pen. I can draw, right? So, all printmaking is based on the idea that any changes to a smooth, flat surface, when rubbed with ink, you can then transfer that ink to a piece of paper, okay? And any inconsistencies in that surface will make the design that transfers. So, as a printmaker, you have two options, right? They're all based on this. You're going to make a series of cuts in the surface, right? And you can either put ink on the top, on the plateaus, or you can push ink down into the valleys and polish the plateaus, right? Those are your two options. Making prints, right? So a woodcut is the tops of the plateaus, a relief print. Whereas the swanky word for engravings and etchings, where you push it in, is intaglio, right? Now, when we're talking about woodcuts, which are relief prints, where we put the ink on the top, right, and carve away the whites, what you get with it is an incredibly forceful and dynamic and expressive line. Because you don't have grays, right? Things are black or they're white. There's no middle tone, right? And whereas with etching and engraving, you can do cross-hatching, right, and get ranges of tone. It's very difficult to do that with a woodcut. Really good woodcutters can, but you got to come in and carve all the little diamonds between the cross-hatching, right? Because you're carving away the whites. So yeah, but you'll notice with Holbein, he more or less avoids that. And what you get, more or less, right? But when you get to shade the nobleman's costume, is a series of calligraphic single lines coming around, right? And in the sky, that cloud, right, has this sort of look like, I don't know, like pulled taffy or something. It looks more solid than the cloud, doesn't it? But the line itself gets a very expressive quality. And the earlier we go into German printmaking, if we go back into the 15th century, we'll see in a little bit, that expressive quality, that distortion, right, it's even stronger still. Okay? So Kollwitz is looking back at this, and what we're going to see is other artists are also looking back at German prints from the Renaissance. Because for them, Germans in the early 20th century, this is kind of the high point of artistic tradition for them. If we took into art history, did we ever talk about Germany between the Renaissance and the modern world? Caspar David Friedrich, right? But really very little. Because, it's kind of not cutting the edge there. And so for them, this is kind of a weird sort of revival, right, of something that is particularly German.
Is it neo-Renaissance?
A mini Renaissance, a lowercase r Renaissance, right? Of course, that word, of course, is French, and so it wouldn't. I wish I had better German. I would go, yes, a Herbrut or something like that. I can't think of what the word is for rebirth in German, right? Well, this kind of graphic quality is picked up by other artists, and we'll be looking a lot at Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. Again, first decade expressionist, not really associated in any way with Katie Kollwitz, in a totally different city. He's in the city of Dresden, right? He was not trained as an artist, maybe it shows. He was a student in architectural engineering, which is where he met a group of artists that worked together to form a group in 1905. And at that point, he began making art around 1905 or so, but no real training in drawing, not even as an amateur. He was going to be an engineer, right, an architect. And these days, architects learn to draw, but Kirchner apparently did not, right? His lack of formal training, however, he said, was not the basis of his style. He said he was trying to make his works look clumsy. He was trying to make his kind of picture making, he was trying to make it unsophisticated, trying to make it look primitive. So if we look at this picture, it's pretty big, right? It's 6 feet tall, 6.5 feet tall. So she's life size or even a little bit larger than me, right? Taller than I am. Does this seem awkward to you as a figure? How? What parts of it seem awkward? Her head and her arms. What about her head and her arms?
Like, so you're looking at the back of her, but
That's right.
from like her neck up, it looks like you're looking at the front of her.
It's almost like she's facing you and turning right. There's this weird sort of cockeyed thing that happens around her waist, to where the shoulders and up look like they're the front, almost, not quite, but almost like the front. And then obviously hips down is from the back, obviously, right? Okay. But at the same time, you can see how the lighter part on the back of her neck could be this bit right back here, right, the nape, and her. But then there's the arms, right? Do this. Try to. Okay, she's drying herself, right? She's got a towel and she's giving us this, right, across the back. And that hand on the right is about right, but the problem is I can't get it to get on this side of my arm, right? It's always on this side. It just doesn't want to go there, on the back side of that, right? And yet he's put it quite obviously to where it's coming up over here instead. And that's just not where your arm works, right? The thumb's kind of in the right place if she's like this, right? Okay? And then this one, the thumb is in the right place, but again, you cannot, unless the police are holding you on the ground, can you get your arm to do that, right? So it's really awkward anatomically speaking, right? Then down below you can see she's got her legs crossed, and this one is, resting on the toe, right? So it's sort of like this. And we can see the pink on the bottom of the sole of her foot. But again, this shouldn't bother us too much, the way it's been broken up. We've seen other artists break things up, right? But there's just this sort of anatomical awkwardness to the top, right? And Kirchner said quite literally that this was a conscious choice on his part. This was not due to his luck. He was trying to be clumsy. And what we'll see as we look at Kirchner's work is that one of the things that he's trying very hard to do, and this is different from Kollwitz, is he's trying to shock us. He's trying to make a work of art that doesn't make you comfortable. And maybe that does share something with Kollwitz, right? I couldn't live with the Kollwitz. I find it just, it's too traumatic. It's just too much. And there's too much emotion there. And the emotion is not a happy one, like a Matisse, right? It's not the joy of life. It's just the eternal sadness of it all. And I couldn't live with it, but for Kirchner, this is consciously ugly. And I mean this in a kind of an interesting way, because this is a theme in modern art that we're going to see, especially with Expressionism, a sort of planned difficulty, where they don't want you to have an easy viewing experience. They want to jolt you out of complacency. They want you to sit up and notice something different from your day-to-day experience. We'll talk more about exactly what that something is, right? But Kirchner wants to kick you in the seat of the pants, right? Poke you in the ribs. He doesn't want you to sit there, and he wants to problematize, make difficult the actual act of viewing. And I find this kind of fascinating. Art that tries on purpose to be difficult, to be ugly, right? And this is not in my notes, but this goes back to a late 18th century idea when it comes to aesthetics in the Romantic period. Right? So Romanticism is sort of late 18th, early 19th century. Right? And one of the things Romanticism did was to focus on elements of human experience that were deeply, deeply engaging. Right? It often did images of death, insanity, and also like landscape that's just overpowering, right? Where nature is just those waterfalls and waves crashing. And this came out of an aesthetic theory called the sublime. We use that term these days for just about anything that's kind of special, right? Oh, that dessert was sublime. But the term originally meant any aesthetic experience that was quite truly unforgettable, whether good or bad, right? A severed head could be sublime, right? A rotting corpse, or a flower bed, right? Or a crashing wave. Things that are so overpowering that you simply cannot forget it. Right? The theory of the sublime is why we all slow down at car wrecks on the highway. Right? What do you hope to see? That thing you don't want to see, but you're fascinated by it. You know? So, in many ways, Kirchner in the Expressionist period is sort of reviving some of these older ideas about art, that there are aesthetic experiences that don't have to be necessarily positive in order to be engaging and effective, right? Now, he's working with the theme. She's meant to be a prostitute. And we know this in Kirchner's work regularly, that the women that he tends to depict in his images are prostitutes. Sometimes they're on the street. In this case, she's between jobs, tricks, if you will, right? Washing herself between clients. And that's a theme that we saw Degas doing quite a few different times. We saw it. We, from the clouds up above, looking down on the history of art. We haven't looked at it in this class, but Degas did a series of, or did we? Did we look at Degas? When we talked about Picasso, I think we looked at Degas, didn't we, right? Right. He did a whole series of women bathing, and they're not just women bathing. We like to call them that because it makes it easier to look at them. But they're prostitutes preparing themselves for work, right? And Kirchner's is very much the same thing. It ties into that exact same tradition. And this massive 7-foot, 6.5-foot canvas was actually painted on both sides. I've never seen that side. They always have this side out when they have it out. Canvas was incredibly expensive. Artists were broke, especially starting out. Kirchner often painted things on both sides of the canvas. So if we turn this canvas over, this is on the opposite side. And what I find interesting about Kirchner in this first decade of the 20th century is the degree to which, if they didn't have the name on it, you might not think they're by the same artist. Look at the figural style and how it's changed from left to right. And we think they're from the same year. But this is much more nebulous, globular, right? The one on the right. More plastic, right? Molten feeling. The application of paint is thicker, more vigorous. There's something almost cubist about the yellow one on the left, right? Something much more symbolist or post-impressionist, Van Gogh-ish about the one on the right. Yet they're both by Kirchner, and they're fascinating as a pair because if this is a woman a prostitute in her room cleaning herself between shifts, those are prostitutes waiting to line up business. Prostitutes to be seen in the quasi-public space of the bordello, right, the brothel, where you come in to see which prostitute as a client you're going to go pay to be with, to get to the point where you might see them behind the scenes bathing. Does that make sense? So there's a quasi-public face on the right, and a more wholly private face on the left. Right? But both of them images of prostitution. This too, like the consciously difficult style of painting, is meant to shake you up. Right? It's not only an uncomfortable style of painting, we'll look at that more closely, it's also an uncomfortable subject matter. And this might account for why we so often see artists using prostitutes as the subject when they're really trying to do something radical. Think Manet with Olympia, the first slide we saw in class, right? Prostitution. You're the client. That's uncomfortable, right? But what he's doing is he wants you to be uncomfortable so that he can get you to look at what he's doing as an artist. Right? Numerous artists have been doing images of prostitutes, right, in their houses of prostitution. Most famously, Toulouse-Lautrec, who hung out at these places, right? Apparently, there's this rumor that his genitalia is preserved in a Parisian whorehouse. That after he died, like they kept it, because apparently it was like. So, that's a rumor out there, right? That they called him the teapot because he was short and well endowed, right? And there's this rumor that it's there somewhere, but he lived there, right? This is his experience, and in many ways, for our expressionists, coming back from the lurid that I drug us into, right? Toulouse-Lautrec is incredibly expressive in the way that he paints, right? I mean, if you look at the color choices and the application of the pigment to the support medium, it's all about vigorous gesture, cartoonish caricatures, amplified color choices, that orange for her hair. All of these elements play into expressionism. He's a hero of theirs, right? And again, of course, Picasso, right, which we looked at in one of the online sections more closely. But certainly, again, prostitution as a motif chosen by male artists as a way of shaking you up, right, making you uncomfortable, so that once you get your normal expectations jostled and rearranged, the things they're trying to do as an artist can make more impact, right? Jolt you out of your world. Now I've got a couple of nice details of this, so we can see the degree to which Kirchner's conscious clumsiness comes through. He's painting almost everything simply with the palette knife. So if you're in the studio and you're painting, right, you mix the paint on your palette. So you got the piece of wood that's got the different oil paints on it, right? You have a little knife that's sort of beveled, right? And it's like a spatula, right? And that's what you use to mix the paints together, right? And usually what you do is you use that to blend the paints, and then you get your brush and you put that on the canvas. He's taking that and he's going right in with the knife, right? Slop, and laying it on like a mason would lay bricks, right? Or mortar for the bricks. It just goes on and slaps, and you can see various places right here, where it's quite obvious that he's used that spatula, right, to lay the paint down. And it's true everywhere, small pieces and large. He's just simply going in and glowing on the paint in this roughshod way that denies the tradition of painting. Add to that look at that foot on the right? Her right foot. It's just, it's very, both of them are awkward. That one especially so. She may have nail polish on, but that's not why she's got green toes, for the left foot. But then if you look at the way that the figural form is built up of just these colors that next to each other are incredibly jarring. Now, you could argue, you know what, that looks an awful lot like Matisse's color choices, doesn't it? In a way? And a lot of people said this. And Kirchner said, And in fact, he went and sort of fabricated this tradition for himself and for the artists he was working with to try to prove to people that he came up with it first. So what he'd do, he would go back and take paintings that were made in 1907, and he'd redate them like 1903, right? So that he could say, see, I'm before Matisse, right? Now, he never got to Paris, so I don't know if he ever even saw a Matisse. It might be somewhat coincidental. He might have seen them in reproductions, but even the reproductions would not have gotten this kind of color, right, in the first decade of the 20th century. There seems to be some connection there. Kirchner tried to deny it everywhere he looked. But they are really just sort of celebrations of this color, and you can see that there's certain things that, I don't know if you would ever see this kind of combo, green, red, orange combo here in a Matisse in the same way. It doesn't have Matisse's use of pastels, for example, that give it more of a more joyful tone. But everywhere we look, the paint is just, some parts, even with that green up above on her buttock, you get the sense that he squeezed it right from the tube onto the canvas. And we have other paintings where what he's done, he's gone one step further than the palette knife, right? He takes his tube of paint and he just does this, right, onto the canvas, and leaves it there, looking like, like Halloween paint, right, you see there. And I think here he's doing something very similar. He's really trying to shake us up, right? A more recent acquisition by the National Gallery is a promised gift. Two nude women under a red umbrella in the countryside. Each of these figures seems to be a very different figural style, doesn't it? In each one of them, he's changing his sense of proportions and the way in which he lays down the paint. That might come from his lack of training, but in each one of them, he's trying to keep the figure and the composition as jarring and discordant as possible, right? He wants it to look untrained. He wants it to look primitive. And I don't have slides to show this, but one of the things he's definitely looking at is non-Western sculpture. Tribal sculpture like Matisse and Picasso as a form for these bodies that he depicts. I find Kirchner's work also somewhat misogynist. There's something violent about the way he paints, and I can't put this into words. But there's a sense of him attacking the form with the brush. If you look at the pink figure and the way he's, the strength with which he outlines the sides of the breasts or the area around her vagina, it's hurtful almost, as if he's attacking the figure as an artist. And we have accounts of how he worked that push this idea home, that the brush for him is like, a weapon. The palette knife like a weapon as he's attacking these figures as an artist. Now again, the Matisse thing, right? Like I said, he denied it. But nude figures in a landscape, think how different these are, right? What is Matisse trying to achieve with the nude figure in the landscape? Right? A sense of harmony, right? A sense of, eternal perfection, right? A golden age that we might return to, right? Where the three primary colors work together to revive ancient Greece, right? Some sort of Arcadia where everything is absolutely perfect. And while the two women might well be enjoying themselves in the out of doors here, given the hat of the woman on the right, there's a sense that they really maybe shouldn't be naked anymore. There's something that's not quite right about us catching them with their clothing off. We talked before about the influence of German Renaissance printmaking, and I wanted to look a little bit further back from Holbein into the 15th century. This is a hand-tinted woodcut, right? So the paint that you see here was actually applied to the woodcut. The woodcut is simply the dark lines that you see that give us this sort of playing card aesthetic, right? Here Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, let this cup pass from me with the three apostles just before he's captured. But look at the expressiveness of the figures. Look at the odd proportions of the heads to the bodies. Look at how even without the color, drawing these figures, the artist is forced on the nose of the apostle on the left, which is probably John. Okay? How, in order to render the face of that figure, the artist is forced to choose between white or black. Right? And if anybody's ever tried to draw the face, the nose is tough. Right? It's just a difficult piece of structure to try to get how these things work, right? The sides of your nostrils. And he's forced to choose. So we get the line coming down the inside of the nose of that figure, becoming this expressive, right, graphic line. Or the other sleeping figures, or even how the clothing itself is handled. This is, and by their own admission, this is the root of Expressionism, is this revival of earlier German art. These are all available on the National Gallery website, right? So I just went back and looked at German printmaking to pull out. These are probably not the ones he was looking at, but probably something similar, where again we can see the emphasis on expressiveness, on Expressionism, right? Now, Kirchner formed a group around these ideas, around the idea of doing works of art that are consciously difficult, that are primitive, apparently unlearned, untrained, and that attempt to shake you out of your day-to-day complacency. And he called this movement, this group, the Bridge. They're in Dresden, right, where he's working. And they formed in 1905, which is roughly the same year that the Fauves broke out. But he later wrote a history of the group and said we formed in 1902. Right, again, to sort of suggest that they were well ahead of the Fauves. He's kind of a blowhard. When he writes about Die Brücke, he writes about himself in the third person. Who does that? Then Kirchner did this. Right? It'd be like me up here. And then Trowbridge went back to his office to meet with his students. Right? Talk about yourself in the third person. Right? Well, that's what he did. And anyway, the movement, the bridge, right, suggests the idea of transition, doesn't it? What's a bridge as a metaphor? It's a movement from here to there, right? It suggests where we are connected to somewhere else, right? That's what he means by the bridge as well, right? There were three other artists originally. Others joined them the next year. They are incredibly close-knit. They're more like an artist's colony rather than a bunch of artists working on similar ideas. So unlike the Fauves, right, where Duran and Matisse know each other, they sometimes travel together, but they're just sort of pursuing similar aims. These people are working in tandem, right? Die Brücke is. Right? They often would gather together in Kirchner's studio to draw as a group, right? And they too often traveled together. And it was Kirchner who gave them the name Die Brücke, the bridge, right? Now, what does the term refer to other than the broader metaphor of connections? Connections between us and something else. Well, first, if we stop with that, right? This is why he wants to shake us up, so that we can now understand that where we are is not an isolated island, but has connections to other things, right? And the only way you can understand that there are connections between your existence and other things is to get out of the complacency of your own existence, right? That's what causes us not to understand empathically what other people are feeling. It's because we get too caught up in what we're doing, right? He wants to shake us out of that. So that's part of it. But the name itself actually comes out of a famous piece of early philosophy, Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Thus spoke Zarathustra, also sprach Zarathustra in German. Right? This is from the late 90s. And this is where the term the bridge actually comes from. It's from the writings of Nietzsche. Right? And in Nietzsche's writing, the bridge is a double metaphor. Nietzsche says that we as humans, at this point in our development in the modern world, have evolved, post-Darwin, we've evolved from a savage past. And we need to acknowledge that we are in the process of evolution. That what we are now is a civilized cover to a savage heritage. Right? We evolved from apes. We evolved from savages. So for Nietzsche, the bridge is understanding that bridge, right? Understanding that modern existence bridges back to a shared, primitive, savage past. Kierkegaard's lifting that because his works, primitive and savage, are meant to show us that within the modern world, regardless of what we see, there are these links to a primitive, savage past that's still there. And that's part of Nietzsche's ideas as well, is that we need to remember that even though we've evolved away from that, that's still part of who we are. Right? Now, Nietzsche's ideas go a step further. Why does he want us to understand that? Because Nietzsche says, we're not done yet. Evolution is a process, and it would be very, very stupid to think that it's stopped. Right? So in the same way that we have evolved from the past, we've crossed a bridge from savagery to modern civilization, there's another bridge in front of us. From where we are now to the next step in evolution. This is what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, the Superman, that we are destined to become Supermen through evolution. Now, these ideas sound kind of interesting and intriguing until you realize this is what inspired Hitler to try to engineer the Aryan race, what inspired the fascists to try to clean society of non-white people, right? Because that idea of the Übermensch was something that we could then dictate. People took Nietzsche and went that direction with it. But for Kierkegaard now, right? Kierkegaard, falling into these philosophical ideas, says that art shows us where we came from, with the idea that then we can change for the better. We can take that next bridge, right? I guess we should think about ourselves in the Florida Keys, right? Right in the middle of them, where there's a bridge going one way back toward Florida, another one going the other way down toward Cuba, down toward Key West. And we're there, and we have to look at these two bridges. We're not just on an island, it's connected, right? We came from one, Kierkegaard's trying to show us that. And the sooner we realize that underneath the surface of our supposed civilization is the vestiges of where we came from. Only when we realize can we take the next step and move on to become these supermen. Right? Does that all make sense? This is a handful of philosophy, right? But it's an important one for 20th century thought in general. Nietzsche's as important as they come for influencing events in the 20th century. But certainly with the bridge, Die Brücke, deriving its terminology directly from Nietzsche. I got a pop culture reference, can be lost on everybody, but I had to put it in because, do you ever see 2001: A Space Odyssey? It starts with the monkeys. You get the monolith. We get to modern space travel. Ends up with the Ubermensch, the space baby, right? At the very end, coming back to Earth, the next round of evolution. And each time this monolith appears and sings to man and inspires him to move to the next level, right? So if you're ever confused by 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the theme song is Wagner's Also sprach Zarathustra, right? That's the name of the music from 2001. So it's pretty straightforward and obvious. There's your lost 45-year-old movie reference. 50 this year, 50 next year, movie reference. Still the best science fiction film ever made. Okay, so Kirchner is trying to shake us up, right? And the point of shaking us up is that we realize the bridge to the past so that we can forge the bridge to the future, right? And not all of the works that he does are prostitutes and nude women rendered in a vigorous style, but at the same time, all the works that he does do have really jarring, difficult color combinations. So the public gardens in Dresden, the flower beds at the public gardens in Dresden, look at that amazing sky. That's a Kirchner pink. He loves these psychedelic hot pinks. What this would look like under a black light, right? It already looks like it's under a black light. The flowers down below, again, rendered primordially, isn't it? And you can see these traces of artists that we've been looking at, from Van Gogh to Gauguin to Matisse, all forming an expressive level of art. Much more peaceful, but still has these jarring color compositions. Also in Dresden, the Bellevue Dance Hall. I can never tell if that's meant to be a street or a canal. I think it's a canal. There's a little figure walking, pulling a wagon in the lower right corner. But again, none of the colors are descriptive. Everything is there to try to jolt you from what you're used to seeing. The fact that the lit side of the dance hall is this incredible sort of aqua green, and the shadowed side, a hotter red, which tends to not fall into shadow, right? It does exactly the opposite. Hunter, you had your hand up.
They both kind of look like when I first saw the gardens,
Uh-huh.
to the right especially, it looks like they're on fire.
Like what?
Like they're on fire.
They do look like they're on fire. It does. Watching the news 2 weeks ago when there was those fires raging in my home state of Oregon, right? You saw these pictures of the Columbia Gorge that was just engulfed in flames, right? That's exactly what it looks like, right? And the sky has that unnatural color. But it's also totally Edvard Munch, right? If you think about the painting of the Scream, right, which we saw, I should have that now, right? Has the same sort of expressiveness to the handling of form with these absolutely unnatural and jarring color compositions, color juxtapositions that are intended with both of them to sort of hit you in the face, right? This is like I said, it's difficult art. It's conscious. I have this love-hate thing with Kirchner. I think his ideas are really kind of fascinating. I like the idea of an art that takes this kind of risk and chance, right? To violate all the rules of standard color theory. Try to make an art that you can't not react to somehow. Even if that reaction is sublime, even if that reaction is revulsion, right? I was never that daring as an artist that's why I'm an art historian, right? It's because I was never took that kind of chance as an artist. And I admire it amazingly because it's kind of a difficult choice to make, to put yourself out there, especially for the kind of criticism that you must be putting yourself in for, to do something like that, something that bold and chancy, right? So Kirchner's kind of at the core of this group, right? He really is the center of it all, of Die Brücke. But like I said, there were other artists who joined with him. And I want to look briefly at a few of those. Let's see where I am here. Erich Heckel was a founding member of the group in 1905, and you can see here with this windmill picture, even though the color range is totally different from Kirchner's, he's still applying the paint with the knife rather than with a brush. It still has that same sort of consciously untraditional, consciously primitive, consciously bad way of applying paint, right? That ends up, because when it looks learned, then you get back to that other part of your brain, right? The left side of your, is it left or right? Which one it is? Which is analytical, left or right? Right brain, left brain. Left is analytical, right? Correct? And right is creative. So left brain is what you learn in a drawing class, where we talk to you about anatomy, and we talk to you about proportion, and chiaroscuro, and one-point perspective, balance and rhythm and harmony. A lot of that is right brainy. Left brain is immediate and vigorous and direct, right? And Heckel is certainly that, right? So diving right in. You can't imagine preparatory drawings for these things, right? That's not the point. The point is just to jump in and do it, right? And you can see as we get this in the sky somewhere here, right, just above the rocks next to the window. You can see that, in fact, some of the paint is applied without even filling in the background. So the bits that we see here just above the outline of whatever this is in the landscape, we have bare canvas poking through all over the place, right? That he's simply going in and diving in with the paint and slapping it on. It's based on some observation, but the long and the short of it is it's this expressive exchange between the artist's hand and the canvas is what you remember about it, right? That directness, that expression. Another detail where we can see it, they become celebrations of pure color, really, when you dive into them. And again, I find these difficult, but at the same time brave and wonderful. Emil Nolde joined the group a year later, in 1906. He was not one of the original members of the Bridge, but joined them. Didn't last very long, only stayed for about a year. I don't think he shared much of Kirchner's interests in Nietzschean evolution. But at the same time, he is interested very much in the expressive quality of paint. So here we see a woman in the flower garden on the left, kneeling, right, working the plants. But the majority of the picture is taken up by that spray of flowers everywhere. What makes it similar to Die Brücke for you guys? Would you associate him with them? This is, by the way, after he left.
It's kind of like the slapping on the
It's very sloppy, right? You said slapping on, but I think sloppy is kind of an interesting word that works quite well with most of the members of this part of Expressionism, is a sort of controlled sloppiness, right? Lena?
There isn't a lot of emphasis on where you think it would be. Like the subject of the title is in the corner, faded away in the pastels,
Yeah.
where the colors on the right side are more vibrant, and that's kind of like where you're drawn to.
That's right, and that's really what he's drawn to as well, is that the interplay of color, right, throughout the rest of the piece. And if we look at those colors, you'll notice the degree to which, like Heckel, and even like Kirchner before, the degree to which those colors are super saturated, right? They're really intense. So the red, are those stamens? What's it called? The middle of a flower. Is that right? Not my field, right? I'm not that kind of doctor. But the yellow bits in the middle are these incredibly intense oranges and yellows, right? And sometimes made more intense by being offset by opposites on the color wheel. So the orange in the middle of the blue, or some green added next to it as well, that punch it out that much more strongly, right? I originally had the idea of maybe doing a discussion around these two, because you can see how both of them are using these super saturated colors to, kick us in the teeth, right? They really want us to not react complacently to the works. But at the same time, Nolde's work, especially now that he's left Die Brücke, becomes, I think, slightly more harmonious, slightly closer to Impressionism, even late Impressionism in his approach. Right. Sometimes also, and we'll quit with this, his subject matters are also tend to be easier, right? We don't seem to see in Nolde's work the same interest in prostitution, right? In this idea of revealing those elements of our existence that are indeed uncivilized, right? The subject matter for Kirchner is often uncivilized subject matter, but less so for Nolde, right? So little girls dancing, even though the figure style is that expressionist, right, post-German Renaissance, heavy graphic outline, right? The subject matter makes it an easier read, something you could conceivably live with, unlike a Kirchner, right? And then one last detail real quick. In this case, the canvas that he's working on, he hasn't even bothered to put gesso down. So you guys know that in a painting class, right, you get the canvas, you nail it to the stretchers that hold it in place, and you cover it with a wash that protects the canvas from the oil seeping in and rotting the canvas, right? It's called gesso, right? And it's a glue, right? It's basically, in this day, it was you'd boil up horses' hooves, right? And bones, right? You ever a good thick soup is because you put a bone in there, and when the bone boils, it gives off collagen, and that makes water thick. So Elmer's glue, most glues are boiled animal parts. It's just the normal thing. We've come up with chemical alternatives, but that's normal for glue. So gesso was basically boiled horses' hooves with lead white added into it, something to turn it up. He hasn't even bothered. This is on unprimed canvas. So the oil has just soaked into the canvas, and we can see the spaces that look brown in the background, and everywhere we look are where those strokes of paint, like Haeckel, like Kirchner, are left with spaces between them that he's never touched. And in this case, really never touched. He hasn't even primed the canvas, which is, again, this untraditional way of painting, right? This is violates the basic rule of a painting class. You get the canvas, you stretch it, you prime it, and then you start, right? He's violating that rule as well. Okay, we'll wrap up the bridge, Die Brücke, and move on to Kandinsky and his group, the Blue Rider, on Friday, right? So I think Seth had asked me about the due dates. I had given some mixed signals on due dates. So you guys all got the email that the due date for the next one is when? Friday, right? So that gives you a chance to have a look ahead, and when we talk about Kandinsky, we'll know everything about it, right? I'll be getting your comments back to you on your first round of modern movement essays sometime this week. I've got a bunch coming in from intro as well, so they'll be getting back to you soon with comments. Okay? Fadi, how are you doing? I saw that you say. Let me stop this so you.